second speaker is the well-known Brian Wiltshire, well-known broadcaster with Radio 2GB and the author of 4 books. Brian Wiltshire began his highly successful career at 2NZ in 1969. He is well known for originating the much-copied Midnight Matchmaker, which ran from 1982 to 1991, and the whistle-blowing on political and health matters, which led to Senator Gareth Evans threatening a parliamentary investigation of his radio show in 1988. Well, that's being a celebrity, definitely. Brian is currently writing a book dealing largely with Agenda 21, sustainability, and has interviewed Lord Monckton on this subject on Radio 2GB. Please welcome Brian Wiltshire.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me along. It was somewhat at the last minute, and I hope Dr. Amy McGrath is okay.
Dr. Amy McGrath is fine. She's just having cataracts tomorrow and she wants to know.
Fair enough. That's good news. I wasn't planning on including a comedy piece, but I will just share an email that came in from a listener yesterday, which is not apropos of what we're talking about, but a young fella raced into the lounge room and he said, "Granny, have you seen my pills? Little pills, they're marked LSD." She said, "To hell with the pills, have you seen the dragons in the kitchen?" That's as good as it gets, I think. Talking about the Earth as some sort of source of worship, James Lovelock, who came up with the Gaia theory, had a few things to say to the BBC 3 years ago on Saturday. I remember this because that's my birthday, you see, and local media didn't bother to pass it on. Later that year, he said, "I apologise for being an alarmist." That bit was passed on. But he also said, back on March the 30th, 3 years ago, that we can't change the weather, we might as well deal with it, and in any case, we're going to need as much CO2 as we can put into the air because the ice age is imminent, about 1,000 years overdue. And that is going to change everything. We probably won't see it in our lifetimes. It could be 1,000 years from now, or it could be started already. But the steps to deal with the ice age are going to put private property under the greatest threat that it's ever had. Because areas around the equator are going to be the lifeboat of the world. And you can bet the United Nations will move in and say, well, we've got to save the people. Some of them will be quite happy for 6 billion to perish of hunger, which will be the first impact of a very long winter. And they'll be saying to anyone that's got any property on the equator, so just budge up a bit, more people coming, we've got millions to save. Feeding them all might be quite a problem. If we've got a few hundred years to prepare, then we may well have the technology to feed them, and hopefully the technology to put up a mirror in space or something like that and warm the Earth and make sure the ice age doesn't come down. But regarding the weather thing, as Peter just explained, CO2 comes into the atmosphere after a heating period, on average about 800 years. And I mentioned this to Ian Plimer a couple of years ago, and he wrote a letter to the paper about it the following day. It appeared 2 days later in the Australian, because no one else had noticed it. If you get extra CO2 800 years after a warming period, then the extra CO2 we're noticing now is not really ours. It comes out of the oceans because of the medieval warming period. And incidentally, there is a climate gate number 3 on the way. This hasn't hit the mainstream media either. 220,000 emails. Whoever it is who's been intercepting these things has discovered more emails involving Michael Mann, who composed that infamous hockey stick graph, which decided all the history was wrong and there was no growing of grapes in the middle of England. There's no Vine Street on your Monopoly board. It was all just a figment of someone's imagination. And he is discussing in some of these emails with one of his colleagues about, well, the figures don't add up. It looks like it wasn't medieval warming period after all. He's going to be very embarrassed when all this hits the media. I just thought I'd just mention that. Now, one of the most interesting things I've read over the years involves oxygen therapy. and how life evolved when there was much more oxygen in the atmosphere. And now, in some parts, we are suffering a shortage of oxygen. In Tokyo, for instance, police are given little bottles of oxygen so they take a puff every so often, because in the centre of some cities, thanks to all the internal combustion engines, the level of oxygen gets down to 10% from about 20%. Below 10%, you are in real trouble. Where do we get the oxygen? Photosynthesis from plants, and we have to give plants CO2. If we cut back on the CO2, we are starving the plants, so not only do we get fewer plants, but we get less oxygen. And even if we stop driving all our cars and trucks, we still have bushfires started by lightning all the time, all around the world. We don't want to run out of oxygen, and therefore we must not cut back on the CO2. Something else I haven't seen in the mainstream media, that one of the few things I can recall from my school days, we used to get a thing called the Current Affairs Bulletin. Is that still published?
Unfortunately not.
It was a university publication. And around about 1960, the CSIRO did a survey, or study, into how many people Australia could carry. And they said if we dammed every river, Australia could carry 20 million people with the technology of 1960. At that stage, I think we had about 9 million people. So we're over carrying capacity at the moment, according to the opinion of the CSIRO of over 50 years ago. Just getting on to sustainability for a moment, because that is an alternative word for Agenda 21, which is the United Nations agenda for the 21st century, which is based, I would imagine, on the principle, the greatest good for the greatest number. Anybody here who disagrees with this idea, let's have the greatest good for the greatest number? Okay, you're all on side then, you must all be socialists. It's a very hard thing to argue with, pardon me, as is sustainability. Who's going to put the hand up and say, no, I think we should be unsustainable? You'd be laughed out of the room, wouldn't you? But last year, while researching for the book I'm writing, which unfortunately is called What Lies Ahead, if I just called it What the Media Should Have Told You, I could publish it at any moment, volumes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and so on. But no, What Lies Ahead actually depends on tomorrow's headlines to some degree, so it's very difficult to finish it. But sustainability actually isn't sustainable unless everybody does it at the same time. It's exactly the same as disarmament. If everyone did it at once, well, no one would be taking advantage of the situation. But one of the strongest lessons of history is that bamboo gives way to steel. The Kurrawa people of West Papua are being pushed out of their tree houses by the inexorable march of the Indonesians with their guns from the west to the east. And strangely, the Kurrawa people have an ancient legend passed down through countless generations that this would happen to them one day. That lighter-skinned people would move in from the west and push them out of their traditional lands. How anyone could have guessed this would happen, I really don't know. But as far as sustainability is concerned, okay, you try it, and we'll stand over here and see how it pans out for you. Because China's not doing it. China is industrializing, as everybody knows, and spending a fortune on their so-called defense forces. And China had a defense minister, I think it was defense minister or deputy defense minister a few years ago, Chi Haoshian. Any of you heard of him? He was reported by the BBC in 1999 as saying war with the West is inevitable. What wasn't reported by the West was his internal speech around about 2004-2005 called War is the Midwife of the Chinese Century. You can get this on the internet. And he said to his comrades, we are going to take over the lands of Canada, the USA and Australia. Nothing personal. We know America helped us out against Japan and that sort of thing. This is not a personal thing, but we need the space. But he said we mustn't call it Lebensraum, because that's Nazi stuff. That's what Hitler wanted, space for his people as he moved out. So we won't call it that, but actually we need the space. They are very envious of the fact that we can see the stars at night. We have blue skies instead of white or dark skies, and water we can drink out of the tap. And our soil is not polluted. So they're simply hoping that they can come up with a biological agent that takes us out but doesn't take them out. Perhaps they will never do it. Perhaps our DNA is so similar that they won't get that biological weapon, but if they do, or if they quietly immunise a number of their people against smallpox and then reintroduce smallpox to the world, they can have any part of it they like. But they won't be using nukes because that would spoil the land that they want to take over as nice clean land. Media hasn't looked into that one yet. So if we go for sustainability, that's the deindustrialisation that Maurice Strong spoke about when he organised the Rio Conference 21 years ago, from which we get the Agenda 21. He said words to the effect that isn't it our duty to deindustrialise the West? The environmental impact, the footprint of people in the West would require some 7 extra planets to sustain if everyone in the world were to live as the average American did about 10 years ago. They're not living quite so well now, although some of the jobs are coming back to the United States. Deindustrialise the West. That means we have to do whatever the people with guns tell us what to do. It means completely vulnerable, defenceless, which is quite an extraordinary thing to ask of us. I have a wife who can read my mind. I have to be careful what I think about. I did a simple back-of-the-envelope guesstimate of how much oil we could have if we had to share it with everybody as yet unborn. 4.5 billion years for the future life of the Earth, barring asteroid impacts and the like, and how much oil we've got at the moment and how much we're likely to discover. And I came to the conclusion, and I wrote it down as 2 teaspoons of oil each from now on. That's all you're going to get. And then I went down to the house for dinner and I said, guess what? I've worked out how much oil we can have if we share it with all the people as yet unborn. How much do you think we get? She said 2 teaspoons. How could she guess that? Even getting the amount right, but the way that I put it is not the way you normally measure oil. It comes in barrels, not teaspoons. But if we're going to have to share it, it'll be teaspoons. And that brings up the moral question, which the media never deals with. Who deserves the last lump of coal? Who should get the last litre of oil? Can you think of any reason why someone as yet unborn has a greater right to it than you? Perhaps the person driving the ambulance has a greater call for the last litre of oil. And you can just forget that drive to a picnic place on the weekend, save that bit of petrol for some ambulance in the future. We haven't even begun to discuss how much we have to share with the people of the future. But the future is not what we might have imagined it to be. When the Ice Age does come, that's a 100,000 year winter. By the end of that winter, before the ice melts, it's about 3 kilometres thick over most of the lands which are at present populated. This is not going to do humans the slightest bit of good, or the animals, or the plants. Life will continue, we hope, around the equator, unless it's a snowball Earth situation, which I think we had about 8 million years ago, or maybe 650,000, give or take. That's when the ice caps met at the equator. And it was almost an extinction level event. So you've got to think to yourself, how much should we be sharing, given we might have only 1,000 years before the party is over, for most people? And it occurred to me, just back to that Chi Haoshian speech, one thing that put some urgency in the minds of the Chinese government was the fact that whenever they noticed Western leaders getting together and having a talk fest, people like Bill Gates and Ted Turner of CNN do a lot of tut-tutting about how there are too many people on the planet. We'd be much better off with just 500 million. We'd have a more manageable planet then. And the Chinese look at one another and they say, that's us. They're talking about us. We'll have to hit them before they hit us. Because they couldn't imagine that the Western people would be talking about killing themselves just to save the planet. Too many people? We've got 1.3 billion? Uh-oh, trouble brewing. No wonder they're spending a huge amount on defence. So, all the value systems are going to change rather dramatically when we realise that there isn't a summer to melt the snows. Even a little ice age would cause massive crop failures. That means massive starvation. And it occurred to me last year, and I was thinking about this, hold on a second. A lot of these people want depopulation. Stalin demonstrated that the cleanest way to do it was just to take the food away from the people. And here Mother Nature is going to do it for them. And hold on a second, they're calling for geoengineering to bring on the Ice Age. Did you read about this in the media? You probably read about geoengineering, putting little particles of stuff in the atmosphere or stuff in space that cuts down on the sun's radiation, because this warming is so bad. Like everyone when they retire heads off to Antarctica. No, they go to Florida or they go to Queensland because they like the warmth. And as someone wrote in The Australian a couple of years ago, how come we've given a long list of things that are really bad about warming, but no one ever gives us the list of things that are bad about cooling? They're much worse. Cooling kills far more than warming. The whole argument has been skewed. And one of the things that skewed it, Peter Singer, I think it was, who wrote Animal Liberation, that was the man, was it not?
Yes.
He spoke about biocentrism, the belief that human interest should not always prevail. Have you heard of biocentrism? This is one of the, for want of a better word, philosophies that we are up against here. The most extreme example came a few months ago when somebody put in an environmental development application or the equivalent in order to do some mining in Queensland. And there were 1,400 conditions that were handed back to them. And one of those conditions was for the relocation of a colony of redback spiders. You've heard of this. I kid you not. It doesn't get any crazier than that. People in Sydney are breeding in sharks and they're putting them back in the water at Shelley Beach where the kids paddle. Oh, wobbegongs don't kill people, but if you tread on one, they'll bite you. Not to worry, human rights doesn't matter. Chap the other day that wrangled the shark, then went back to England, and now he's in trouble because he was supposed to be on a disability pension. And you don't wrangle sharks on a disability pension. He's lucky he's in trouble in England. If he'd stayed here, he could have been jailed for 2 years. Yeah, you're not allowed to get close to a shark. They're just as sacred as the whales. And yet, all sorts of things can happen to people, and the courts generally will let you off if you've got a good lawyer. When I did law, somewhat unsuccessfully 50 years ago, there was the saying that if you had the money, they could get you off anything but a parking ticket. And the same is true today. There's always an excuse. You've probably read the latest excuse from asylum seekers. I was caught with this chap's wife and he's so angry he chased me through the street firing a gun at me. And if I go back to Iraq, he'll track me down and kill me. And the tribunal said, yeah, that's fair enough. That's okay. It's not persecution according to the United Nations rules that we've signed up to, but hey, persecuted by one person, one angry husband. Larry Pickering has a website which is worth keeping an eye on. I can't endorse what it has, but he's one of those people outside whose place things fall off the back of trucks. His latest claim is that many of the refugees from Afghanistan are absconders from the army. And if you think, what would make you pack up everything and risk your life to head to another country?